In 1913, the best-equipped gold hunting expedition ever sent into the Australian interior drove west out of Alice Springs, chasing a single sentence. The sentence claimed a reef of gold-bearing quartz, 14 miles long, assaying 3 ounces of gold to the tonne. At a July 2026 gold price of about $4,000 an ounce, that is more than $12,000 of metal in every single ton of rock. 7 months later, the expedition's aeroplane was wrecked. The party had broken up in mutual accusation, and the man who wrote that sentence was dead of starvation in the Petermann Ranges. He was killed not by a cave-in or a claim jumper, but by his own claim. His name was Louis Hubert Lasseter, though he called himself Harold Bell Lasseter. 14 miles is 22 kilometers. 3 ounces to the long ton, the measure of his day, works out at about 90 grams a ton. In the 95 years since he died, at least 13 major expeditions are on record as having gone looking, and not one has come back with an ounce. Almost every retelling asks the same question: where is it? That is the wrong question, and it is why the search has never ended. The right question is whether the rock in that part of Australia can make such a thing at all. Gold is not sprinkled at random across a continent. It is concentrated by specific processes in specific rocks at specific temperatures, and geologists now know exactly what lies under the ground Lasseter walked into. So keep the two halves apart, what is documented and what was only ever claimed. Start with the documented half. Lasseter was born in 1880 at Bamganye in Victoria. Self-educated, literate and well-spoken, and in the judgment of the Australian Dictionary of Biography, a poseur who had little regard for the truth. That is not a modern insult, but a conclusion drawn from a paper trail. In September 1929, Lasseter publicly claimed to be the original designer of an arch bridge across Sydney Harbour, and asked to be paid for 6 months of work on it. He had submitted a bridge design of his own in 1913. The bridge, then rising over the harbour, was not his. Weeks later, on the 14th of October 1929, he wrote to the government about the gold. The dates he gave never settled. In one account, he had found the reef 18 years earlier, around 1911. In another, given to John Bailey of the Australian Workers' Union in March 1930, he had found it 33 years before, as a boy of about 17, which puts it in the 1890s. He said a surveyor had once helped him fix the position, but their watches were wrong, so the longitude was wrong too. It was a perfect claim, specific enough to fund, vague enough that failure proved nothing. In 1930, it worked. The Central Australian Gold Exploration Company was floated. Roughly £50,000 was raised in the second year of the Great Depression, and on the 21st of July, the expedition left Alice Springs heading west. The kit was extraordinary for the time. A 6-wheeled Thornycroft truck and a de Havilland Moth aeroplane called the Golden Quest, flown by a pilot named Errol Coote. Fred Blakely led the party, George Sutherland prospected, and Lasseter came along as the guide, on a weekly wage. None of it helped. The truck bogged in the sandhills. The aeroplane was wrecked about 250 miles out from Alice Springs and had to be replaced. And at every landmark, the guide could not say where they were. At Mount Marjorie, Lasseter announced that the party was 240 kilometers too far north. Blakely had heard enough. He called Lasseter a charlatan, and in September, the expedition fell apart. Lasseter would not stop. He went on with a dingo hunter named Paul Johns, who had camels. In late October, in the Petermann Ranges, Lasseter told Johns he had found the reef, then refused to show him what he was carrying. They quarreled, and Johns left. Soon after, Lasseter's camels bolted with almost all of his supplies. He sheltered about 25 days in a small cave beside Hull Creek, kept alive by Pitjantjatjara people who brought him food and water. When he finally set out east on foot toward Kata Tjuta, he had nothing left. He died in the Petermann Ranges at the end of January 1931.
His death certificate gives the 30th. Accounts still argue over which creek. The bushman Bob Buck found the body that March and buried it. The cave is a signposted stop on the road today. His diary and his last letter survive, held with the company's records in the State Library of New South Wales. Read them and you do not meet a con man laughing at his backers. You meet a man writing alone and starving, as though the reef were real. Later that year, Young Idris published Lasseter's Last Ride, a dramatized retelling that turned a failed expedition into a national legend. Now the geology, the part usually left out entirely.
A gold reef of the kind Lasseter described is not a random streak of metal. It is a quartz vein deposited out of hot water moving through a fault. Geologists call it orogenic gold, and it has a narrow recipe. You need a mountain-building event driving fluid up a deep crustal fault, rocks brittle enough to crack open and hold a vein, and the right temperature. Most orogenic gold forms between roughly 200 and 400 degrees Celsius, and even the deepest, hottest examples on record top out around 700. That is the band in which gold comes out of solution and collects. Cook the rock far past it, and the water is driven out of the minerals before it can carry metal anywhere, and the rock flows instead of cracking, so there is nothing to hold a vein open. That recipe is why Australia's great gold fields sit where they do. Kalgoorlie's lodes are in the ancient greenstone belts of the Yilgarn Craton. Bendigo and Ballarat sit in folded Paleozoic sediments in Victoria. The Northern Territory does have real gold, at Arltunga, east of Alice Springs, and in the Tanami, hundreds of kilometers to the northwest. None of those places resembles the country Lasseter walked into. The Petermann Ranges expose the Musgrave province. These are Proterozoic granulites and gneisses, rocks cooked at over 1,000 degrees Celsius during a mountain building event between about 1200 and 1100 million years ago. Then, in the Petermann orogeny, roughly 630 to 520 million years ago, the continent squeezed in on itself and drove those deep rocks to the surface along a colossal fault called the Woodruff Thrust. What is exposed there is the root of an old mountain belt, a level that reefs of this kind never reach because they form far above it. Everything about that is wrong for the story. The rock was cooked hundreds of degrees past the window in which gold reefs form. The surface is made of material from below the depth at which that chemistry works. The last mountain building event there finished 500 million years ago, and no gold mine has ever been developed anywhere in the Musgrave province. Two geologists who went out with Bob Buck in 1931, Blatchford and Talbot, reached the same verdict without any modern data. They pronounced the Petermann and Eastern Rawlinson Ranges unpromising. Then there is the grade. 90 grams a ton is not simply a rich mine. It is something like 50 times the grade of the ore the superpeated Kalgoorlie mills today, which runs between about 1 and 2 grams a ton, on the richest square mile of gold ever found by concentration, though South Africa's Witwatersrand has produced far more metal in total. 90 grams is also around 15 times the grade of Kelly in the Tanami, the Northern Territory's biggest gold mine. And the claim was not a pocket at that grade. It described 22 continuous kilometers of it. The super pit itself is about 3.5 kilometers long. Grade like that comes in lenses. Australia's own outlier, the Swan Zone at Fosterville in Victoria, booked reserves around 60 grams a ton in 2017. But Swan held well under 1 million tons of ore in a body measured in hundreds of meters. Nothing on Earth sustains 90 grams a ton for 22 kilometers. Rock that rich also cannot hide. Gold at that concentration sheds into creeks, leaving alluvial grains and a chemical halo in the sediment for kilometers downstream. Since Lasseter died, the continent has been flown for magnetics and radiometrics, mapped from orbit for surface minerals, and sampled for the National Geochemical Survey of Australia, which analyzed sediment draining more than 1,100 catchments. A 22-kilometer reef at that grade would show up in a net that size. Central Australia shows nothing. Prospectors were never the only ones looking. And yet, that country is not barren, which is the part almost nobody tells. In the year 2000, drilling in the West Musgrave, at the far western end of the country the searchers count, hit Nebo Babel, a magmatic nickel-copper sulfide deposit. Near it lie the Wingelina nickel laterites, the Sukov copper deposit, and prospects called Atlas and Jameson, where platinum group metals sit in magnetite layers, whose chemistry resembles South Africa's Bushveld complex. Here is the irony. In layered igneous rock like that, geologists call a thin, metal-rich layer a reef. The most famous is South Africa's Merensky Reef. So there are reefs in Lasseter's search area after all. They carry nickel, copper and platinum, with gold only as a trace, and they were found by aircraft, magnetometers and drill rigs 70 years after a man died looking for something that rock was never built to make. None of this has killed the search. The diary is real, the deaths were real. The ground is enormous, and Lasseter's own son spent decades looking. There is also a practical reason the country has never been combed. Most of it is inalienable Aboriginal freehold. The Petermann Aboriginal Land Trust alone covers nearly 45,000 square kilometers, and the surrounding Katiti Petermann Indigenous Protected Area runs to 5 million hectares. You go in by permit, as a guest. Every checkable element of this story checks out, except the one thing it is famous for.
There was a man, a company, an aeroplane, a cave, a diary, and a death certificate. There is no reef, no sample, no assay, and no rock of the kind that makes one. The likeliest explanation is the least romantic. A quartz outcrop stained with iron oxide can flash like gold in low sun, and a man who had already claimed the Sydney Harbour Bridge did not need much to convince himself of the rest. But that is not why the story survives. It survives on a fear that Australia is very good at producing, that the interior is so large that something enormous could be sitting out in it, seen once, written down wrong, and never found again. The geology says no. The map still feels like it says maybe. Lasseter's reef was never in the ground. It was in the size of the country.
If you want more Australian geology mysteries, there is another one on the channel we think you will like.